Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a political podcast that won't cross its Brexit red lines. And how are you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. I've got a new mic, as you can hear. Hooray, hooray.
Yes,
hooray.
So have I.
Hooray.
I've also got a new mic. Well, I mean, we now heard that in glorious Technicolor.
Thank you.
That's how sound works, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
Okay, this week, again, the headlines are Brexit. We're just going to skip straight on into Brexit. Apologies about that. It's kind of a big deal. I suppose maybe just before we barrel on in, what date is it, Rob?
It is. I'm bad with months. Oh God, I've even messed that up. It's April the 9th.
So I thought we should have left by now. That was kind of the plan, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And look, as a country, the UK knows that it's messed up a little bit here, and we're all terribly sorry for the delay. If you knew anything about our train system, you would have just taken this as a given the soon we announced, when we announced the time that we were going to be a little bit late for it. So, we're all very embarrassed about it. So please don't bring it up again. That's our message to the world, I think.
Yeah, definitely don't do a Donald Tusk and remind us that the 12th of April is now the 29th of March. Which is the kind of brilliant logic you could have only managed to get out of the Brexit process. I mean, politicians do like to say tautologies and other weird things, but really Brexit has given us some of the best, from Brexit means Brexit to that. I mean, it's been a barrel of laughs, hasn't it? Let's carry on into our main story for the night. So Brexit. So Theresa May did something a bit unexpected this week. What was that, Rob?
Yeah, so she's gone across to Jeremy Corbyn and essentially asked for his help in getting a deal through Parliament, something that will win the confidence of the House and enable us to leave the EU for good.
I mean, that's quite a change, right, from what she previously said?
Yes, totally. So, I mean, there's a few reasons why Theresa May has found herself in this position. So I've boiled it down to two. So the first one is that her deal is obviously dead.
I mean, we said that the first time, we said that the second time. Maybe the third time we can be right?
Yes, well, this is what's so frustrating about Theresa May. And I often go off on one about Theresa May's leadership abilities, but it's frustrating that something that was so blatantly clear to me, a relative layperson in politics, somebody who could see from the sidelines going, this isn't going to work, that she still persisted two more times to try and get it through, and it still failed. And it's frustrating we've wasted so much time on this point. But the third time it failed really was the stake through the heart of May's deal. I think last time we talked, the day before, there were rumours that there are some people from Labour's side coming over. You even had people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson, Dominic Raab, the ex-Brexit secretary, and even David Davis saying, yes, even though we've talked some rubbish and thought May's deal was bad in the past, I've now reached a point where I'm prepared to vote for it. Even with all those big names, it still failed, and it didn't fail by a very narrow margin. It failed by, quite a few. I think it was over 100 votes in the end, the sort of margin which it just shows that the deal would need a major revision if it was to win the support of the House. And that's something that May has repeatedly sort of said that she's not prepared to do.
It is kind of crazy in a lot of ways, as the whole Brexit process has been. But now we have a Conservative Prime Minister finally reaching across the aisle to talk to an opposition leader who she kind of, I mean, her and her party, not entirely her necessarily, but they've said, he's a Marxist, he's too left-wing, all of this, and we couldn't possibly countenance doing something with him, but in the end, this deadlock has forced her hand to actually try something, because it's better than dealing with some of the more right-wing policies that some of her colleagues would like.
Yeah, Theresa May had before doubled down on the prospect that the Conservatives, that she'd get this through with just the Conservatives' help, and that meant getting the right-wing ERG on her side, something that she failed to do in the end. And, she also failed to get the DUP on board, the ones who she paid £1 billion for the privilege of. The one time they were meant to support her, they found themselves they couldn't. So now the Conservative Party is in a position where there's certainly a bit of a split between the backbenchers and the ERG, who had become so influential in May's thinking. She was trying to reach concessions with them, and they were seen as gaining quite a bit of power in the party. They're now almost an irrelevance, as Theresa May's put them to one side and said, sorry, I don't need to listen to your opinion anymore. This is why I'm going over to Labour. It might show that she's made good on her threat. She always said that there could be no deal, her deal, or no Brexit at all. Now that she's abandoned the ERG, it's pretty clear that no deal isn't an option anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not just the indicative votes in Parliament that have said that. I think the majority, I think there's a poll, I'll try and find it to put in the show notes, saying that the majority of the public doesn't want no deal. No deal is dead in the water, but it is still the thing that happens if we don't do anything.
Yeah, precisely. So with that gone, the ERG suddenly have no power over her, and she goes, right, then it's no Brexit or a softer Brexit deal. I think I might be able to get a softer Brexit deal through Parliament, but it'll need the help of Labour because I'm instantly losing those, that sort of core 40 to 50 ERG votes that she would have had in the past. So it's those divisions within the Conservative Party that have basically led her to reach across the aisle and go to Jeremy Corbyn to try and sort this whole mess out.
So Brexit means Brexit, obviously. So what does this new Conservative Brexit look like? And do we think Labour's going to play ball on it? Because, Jeremy Corbyn's negotiators have gone in with some specific instructions, and I'm not sure how they line up with what has been said to be the Conservative position, but I think they might align more with the Remain parts of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, exactly. What I've tried to do here is I've gone to each party's website and I've copied and pasted their sort of stuff that they've got to say on Brexit. This is still up now, and I don't know if you want to pop those in the show notes. I think anybody who in chat right now who looks at the Conservative plan will notice a slight error in point number 1, but we'll get to that later. I just wanted to sort of look at the two parties' main way that they set themselves out at the 2017 general election, what Brexit means to both of those parties, and how those differing ideas can combine to form a deal. Because, that thing I put in the show notes about Brexit meaning Brexit, obviously, Brexit means a lot of different things to a lot of people. We've always said that was the main flaw of the referendum, that although it was to leave the EU, there was no clear white paper and no clear goal for any one side to sort of point to and say, this is what Brexit means, this is why I voted. So these interpretations are really important for understanding where the country can go forward and where there are points of sort of unity on Brexit and where the biggest fault lines are between the two parties and the sticking points.
We've got these two different plans. Do you want to talk about point 1 right now, or do you want to move back to that in a bit?
Well, I thought we might start with Labour's plan, mostly because it's shorter than the Conservatives and gives us a little bit of context for what they're looking for. And then we'll move to the Conservatives. So we can compare the Conservatives against May's deal, because the deal that she's been able to strike with the EU is certainly her deal, and it shows what she wants to do. And that's been proven by the fact that she's lost 2 Brexit, leaders of Brexit in the cabinet, with David Davis and Dominic Raab as Brexit secretaries resigning because they couldn't get the more Brexity way that they wanted to go ahead. I'm saying Brexit far too much. I apologise.
Brexit. Because
those sort of hardliners couldn't get their vision of Brexit through. It's very clear that this is May's deal, and she's nailed her colours to the mast with that. So with the deal that we've been presented with, we're left with sort of 395 pages of what the Conservatives think on Brexit. What Labour think is probably far, far shorter. So this is what we've got to try and combine. So that's why I just thought we'd start with Labour first.
Okay, so shall I read that out then, and then you can comment on it?
Yes, please. So
I can add in some comments as well. But so Labour's priority is to get the best Brexit deal for jobs and living standards, to underpin our plans to upgrade the economy and invest in every community and region. But this government's divisions, incompetence and deregulation obsession put that at risk. During the transition period, Labour would seek to remain in a customs union with the EU and within the single market. That means we would abide by the existing rules of both. Labour rejects a Conservative policy of a race to the bottom on standards and rights. We will treat EU protections as a floor, not a ceiling. So shall we start with just that bit?
Yeah. What did you want to say on sort of Labour's view of things there?
So firstly, I think broadly I agree. If we're going to have to get a deal, I would obviously prefer the one that ensures people don't lose jobs and that we manage to maintain rights and living standards we're used to. Whether that's achievable is a different thing, but at least that's a good aim to have in my book. And yeah, I think staying in the customs union and the single market is something I would like, personally. Although I feel we could very easily get into that situation that people brought up in the referendum of actually having rules decided for us because we wouldn't have a say anymore. We'd just be having to agree to the customs union.
Yeah, totally. I would also like to point out how short it is, and how it only kind of has 1 or 2 points to make, really, on the whole leaving the EU thing. The customs unit and within the single market is pretty big. That's saying that we want to remain with the economy very much as it is. And the jobs and standards thing is very much a Labour point of view where you'll see a lot of fights with the Conservatives about that. The big fear from Labour has always been that the Conservatives would use that to deregulate, make, in an attempt to make Britain far more competitive with the rest of the world. They would have to get rid of health and safety regulations because they take up too much red tape and too much cost, and Labour wants to protect that. So that seems sensible, but is very much at odds with Conservative policy. The other final bit I wanted to point out in that one is the first line. Labour's priority is to get the best Brexit deal for jobs and living standards, which sounds great. I'd love that, but how you go about it is super vague. there's kind of nothing within the rest of that explains how they're going to achieve that. It's a point that it's almost worth nothing, because the standard I always apply, and apologies if I'm repeating myself on this point, my politics teacher taught me this and it served me well, is that if I was to say the opposite of that sentence, so Labour's priority is to get the worst Brexit deal for jobs and living standards, no sane person would want that. So to say the positive of that is kind of meaningless in a way, or at least it lacks the weight unless you explain how you're going to achieve that. So that's why I take that bit with a little pinch of salt.
So I think that's also a sign of what it's like to be the opposition. You can promise a lot without necessarily having to have a real plan for it. I know there's been some criticism before of Corbyn for this kind of, saying stuff, but it's true of any opposition party. They will normally, at least prior to a general election, you might get some more, when they actually have to have a manifesto, it's a bit different. But when they're in Parliament, they can just criticise, say, oh, we wouldn't do it this way, whether it's Labour or the Conservatives who are in power. The other party can basically just play devil's advocate without having to do anything.
Precisely, which is why maybe Theresa May has reached to Labour to get them involved, because now Labour can't just deflect and point out criticisms. They have to work together if they want any of their points to go across, and they have to stand for something. So those tensions will probably become clearer, and Labour will have to become clearer with their policies and where they want to go, if that is something that's definitely going to become law with the help of Theresa May.
So do you want me to go through the 5 points as well, or is that...
The 5 points are worth going on. So the first bit was sort of from the manifesto and was kind of vaguer. The 5 points come from Jeremy Corbyn's letter he wrote to the EU, I believe I can't remember if it was in December or earlier this year, but around the time where it seemed clear that May's deal wouldn't go through, and he wanted to present an alternative. So things changed slightly, and some of the points here will contradict with what was said in the earlier statement, but it is worth pointing out because I think these 5 points show what Jeremy Corbyn will be negotiating on with Theresa May right now.
Okay, so the 5 points from Jeremy Corbyn's letter. A permanent and comprehensive UK-wide customs union. This would include alignment with the Union Customs Code, a common external tariff, and an agreement on commercial policy that includes a UK say on future EU trade deals. We believe that a customs union is necessary to deliver the frictionless trade that our businesses, workers and consumers need, and it's the only viable way to ensure that there is no hard border on the island of Ireland, which, as we've already noted, is very hard to say. Close alignment with the single market. This should be underpinned by shared institutions and obligations with clear arrangements for dispute resolution. Dynamic alignment on rights and protections so that UK standards keep pace with evolving standards across Europe as a minimum, allowing the UK to lead the way. Clear commitments on participation in EU agencies and funding programmes, including in areas such as the environment, education and industrial regulation. Unambiguous agreements on the detail of future security arrangements, including access to the European arrest warrant and vital shared databases.
So yeah, the main point I wanted to pick up there is, as before, they wanted a united customs union and single market. This is a bit clearer, saying we still want a customs union, which will allow us to have a say on future EU trade deals. And also they say that this is the way to solve the hard border crisis in Ireland. This will avoid us having to have a check at the border, because we will already be in the same customs union as Ireland. So it's quite a neat little way to solve that problem from Labour's point of view. However, they don't want to be in the single market. So the single market is the section that involves like the 4 freedoms. So that's freedom of people, essentially freedom of movement. This has now been abandoned by Labour, it appears, in the 5 points letter, although they still want quite close alignment with the single market, which suggests they want more of the economic benefits, but maybe not some of the other conditions that come with single market membership. That freedom of movement point was something that Labour promised to end in their 2017 manifesto, and has maybe been a little bit controversial from a Remainers point of view. That's something that Remainers have always felt quite comfortable with. Freedom of movement. Me as a Remainer, that's something I've always been quite proud of, and like the fact that we are able to live and work in the EU as well as have people come over here and do just the same. However, I think it's fair to say that was a main point in the Brexit argument. A lot of reasons why people voted for Brexit was to stop freedom of movement, or at least to have a control on immigration. So that shows sort of Labour's colours on that point. The other 3 points are very much in line with what they've said before: a protection of workers' consumer rights, and in other areas such as the environment, education, security, and still being a part of that EU community. Labour are keen in saying we still want to reap some of the benefits of the EU, but we're very aware that we're not a member state still.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about the Conservative position there. Let's run through those points from their manifesto and see how we think that compares with what Labour has said. So, the right Brexit for Britain means 1. Leaving the European Union on the 29th of March 2019. That's gone well.
Yeah, I had to look at that, and as soon as I saw that, I thought, oh, this has to be our main story tonight. That's just too funny to ignore. So yeah, point number 1, right at the top, failed. That's something that, it's not worth comparing the Labour position. I think Labour, would have said if they were in control, they'd want to have done the same. But it's very clear that we're not in that position, and that's one of the big reasons why Theresa May is having to work with Labour, because that first red line was crossed so easily. That first deadline was crossed without a thought. So, yes, I think us and the Conservatives should move swiftly on from that point.
Point 2, immediately shows the difference between the two parties' positions, I suppose. A complete end to freedom of movement, taking back control of our borders.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, when people think of a reason why Brexit happened, or one of the main driving factors behind it, ending freedom of movement or having more control over immigration was a big driver of why people wanted to vote. So I think it's clear why the Conservatives lead with that as point number 2. And say that that's what Brexit means in a fashion. As you mentioned, Labour also consider it quite a big issue, and they mentioned it in their manifesto as well, but it's the point that's most likely to cause friction in the backbenches of the Labour Party. There's a lot of people who see that as a potential stumbling block, one that may not be able to command the support of some Labour MPs if Labour were to agree a deal that ended freedom of movement, and it could lose them a lot of votes as well. I think the political risk of Labour saying they want to end freedom of movement is far greater than the Conservative one. So that's likely to be, it's certainly, Labour didn't include freedom of movement either in the positive or negative when they mentioned that 5 points letter, and they didn't mention it in their speech on the internet, that small paragraph that laid out their red lines. So it's something I think Labour are willing to concede a bit of ground to the Conservatives on, but it won't be without political cost.
Yeah, but at least they're not waving their flag saying, yeah, we're getting rid of freedom of movement in the way the Conservatives are, so they can hide behind that, although I'm sure that it'll be pointed out to them in interviews and stuff, as and when. So point 3, an end to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in the UK, restoring the supremacy of British courts. I just like the terminology, as in it's like we're playing top trumps with courts.
Yeah, precise. My court's better than your court now because it's got supremacy. Thank you very much. In other words, take back control. That was the phrase that arguably won the Brexit referendum, and that's what point 3 gets at. Restore our sovereignty, make British courts sovereign again. Don't have the EU interfering in anything. I think Labour would agree on this point that that's another reason why we agreed to leave. However, Labour have already stated that they want to use the current EU regulations as a floor, not a ceiling. So they want to build on current EU regulations, and that kind of assumes that EU law will be sort of absorbed into British law. British law will just be a copy of EU law and have the old bits that we had, and then they will, and then Labour will keep those rules and will further enshrine workers' rights. The Conservative risk is they want the power to take some of that away. They would still get all the EU laws in the first place. That's why we were talking about right back at the start when we started this thing, like a year ago, about the Henry VIII powers and how everybody was panicking about, oh my goodness, all this law is going to go out of date. The easiest thing is to do a big copy paste of EU law, stick it into British law, and then we'll deal with it later. But at least we have control about which ones we get rid of. Labour, it appears, wouldn't want to delete anything from that list anytime soon. And would actually use it as a base mark for where they want to go. So there's some room for agreement there, but it totally depends who's in power about how they would use that power once they had it.
Yeah, and I think the concern people who want to stay in the EU have there is that, especially the Conservative Party, some of the things that have been said both by Theresa May and the rest of the party sound like a rollback on that. So reducing certain rights we may have, and I'm not saying every law the EU has passed has been brilliant, but I think that's where concern lies in that area. Number 4, no more sending vast sums of money each year to the EU. Instead, a Brexit dividend to spend on domestic priorities like our long-term plan for the NHS.
Yeah, so both would agree on this point. I think Labour want to fund the NHS as much as the Conservative Party do. The NHS is a huge electoral issue, and it's a very popular idea with the British public that it should be given more money to, provide a better service for the country. However, if we look at May's deal, that still contains a divorce settlement and a payment to the EU. The way she's got around speaking about this is saying that once we've left, we will no longer pay money to the EU, which is true, but that is not without a huge back payment or a big sum of money having to be paid in the first place. So on this, I think both parties can agree. It's an easy one to agree on. Nobody's going to say no more money for the NHS, but delivering the Brexit dividend may be easier said than done.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add on that one. Point 5, frictionless trade in goods and flexibility on services. So, frictionless trade, does that mean no tariffs? Is that what they're suggesting? I mean, it's not 100% clear.
Yeah, frictionless trade is kind of free trade by another name. That's what the Conservatives would want, and that's why they are so opposed to this idea of a customs union, which is what Labour are looking for. This is maybe the biggest sticking point. So the biggest problem with a customs union when it comes from terms of trade is that you're part of a group of other countries who all agreed tariffs with countries outside there, and all those tariffs are applied universally. So For example, there was a recent deal with Japan that was negotiated with the EU that Britain is part of at the moment. And that means that if a car comes from Japan to France, then it comes from France to the UK, there's no extra tariff on that because the tariff has already been paid because you're a part of that customs union. If we weren't part of that customs union, we might have the ability to buy a car directly from Japan and we could pay a lower tariff. We could organise that there would be no tariff and that we'd have free trade, and that might be a big boost for the British economy. However, on the flip side, it also means that France could turn around and say, anything you buy from us, the price has just gone up. Or that Japanese car that came from us, that came into France, and then France were trying to sell that Japanese car to the UK, they might bump a bit more tariff on that to get an extra bit of money. So it doesn't necessarily lead to, free trade is a risk reward sort of thing. You take the risk that we can negotiate a free trade deal with the rest of the world, but we might also lose out if we are trading with other EU members. That economic control and the way that you handle that is definitely the biggest sticking point here. That point number 5 is where you go, whoa, I'm not quite sure how the two parties are going to see eye to eye on this one. And honestly, I don't know who will concede first on that point.
Yeah. One thing I want to ask, so I get that. I understand the basics, and I understand, you can't compare the two easily because you have to have the two options on the table, and there's too many moving parts to really compare whether that's going to be a pro or a con. We just know right now we have a certain setup. But flexibility on services, what does that mean? I honestly don't know how we deal with taxing services. I have a vague idea when it comes to stuff like software, but when we're talking business services, things like that, is there a lot of import tax on things like that? I don't know.
So no, and that's not quite the way I read that line from the Conservative 12 points. I think flexibility on services reads to me as the Conservative dream, which has always been part of their sort of membership of the EU. Britain's always liked being part of the EU when it benefits them, but doesn't like it when it has to pay more for Greece or somebody else, something that inconveniences us. That was always sort of Margaret Thatcher's point, and Margaret Thatcher always wanted a bit more power for the UK and, sort of saying, we're special, we should get special treatment on some bits because we pay more than anybody else, blah, blah, blah. Now, that's all of Thatcher's points are up for discussion, but the main point remains is that Britain has always wanted to cherry-pick the best bits of the EU and ignore the bits it doesn't like. So that flexibility on services, to me, shouts as them saying, we still want free trade and we still want a good agreement, but not with any of the sort of, the baggage that came with that before when we were a member of the EU. We want the best deal for us. That's part of making a good deal for Britain. That was what they wanted. That's what Theresa May wanted to get across. That's what I think it's saying anyway. I don't know if it's, picking out particularly how bank services are going to work or, how economic regulation is going to work. That point is up for a lot of interpretation, but that's the way I would read it. It's a very ambitious goal by the Conservatives, but one they clearly, one that they've been pursuing almost as long as the Conservative Party have, been a part of the UK Parliament whilst we've been part of the EU. That's what they've always wanted for Britain. They've always wanted to put Britain's needs first, whereas if you compare that to some of the founding members like France and Germany, sometimes they've been, saying they want the best for the EU as a whole and how they can build strength within the Union.
Number 6, no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, or between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Everyone agrees on this, right? Pretty much.
Yep, that's a core one. I don't see Labour having anything to say about this. Again, we've already got this in May's deal, but the price is the backstop. The backstop seems to be something that the EU is unwilling to shift on as well. So maybe the biggest question mark about this is, will the more Brexity Labour MPs support this motion? My feeling is that they probably will, but the backstop won't go away, and don't expect it not to be mentioned if a deal comes out between Conservative and Labour. I think that issue will still remain in very much, the same as it was in May's deal.
Number 7, a parliamentary lock on all new rules and regulations.
Yeah, this is kind of a repeat of the one above about like the sovereignty of courts. This again is saying that, oh, by the way, not only will our courts be sovereign, but any law and everything that we pass won't be subject to EU law. It's take back control again, and yeah, both sides would definitely agree on this point.
And then number 8, which is actually quite a nice thing to see, although we can go into it a bit, a commitment to maintain high standards on consumer and employment rights and the environment.
Yeah, so we saw from Labour's points that they were saying that all the Conservatives are going to look to undermine these, the Conservatives, the enemy, they're definitely going to cut back. But this kind of puts that all into doubt and says that the Conservatives, no, they recognise that there are positive bits of protection that the EU law has provided us, particularly with consumer and employment rights and the environment. So this is sort of an appeal to the softer Brexit voters, or maybe the Conservatives with a small c who don't want to see all their rights stripped away. And I think the parties could come to an agreement on this. When Labour was in opposition, it was quite an easy political scoring point to attack the Conservatives as nasty, evil, rich Conservatives will mess you up on workers' rights. This is the Conservatives' counterpunch to that, essentially.
Although there are already still discussions about trade deals with America and that reducing the standards on incoming food, for example. So regardless of what it says here, there's definitely concern still in that area.
Precisely. Yeah. If either party actually agrees that US trade deal is up for debate, they might have to out of necessity. But yeah, it's certain that both parties would disagree on a couple of points there.
So 9, leaving the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policy.
Yeah, so I think this again is harking back to a reason of why people voted for Brexit. The common agricultural policy and fisheries policy is something that's been criticised by farmers and by fishermen alike. Was kind of a common anti-EU sentiment that, the EU won't let us fish in our own waters, they've got too much control. So this is quite a traditional conservative bashing point on the EU, and getting rid of those is meant to please the party faithful. I don't think it carries as much weight within Labour, those points, and particularly if we're part of a customs union, that might not be possible. Maybe part of our agreements, and how much we trade fish for is how much fish we take out of the sea. Some could even argue that the common fisheries policy is more of like protecting the environment measure than it is an economic measure. So I think there'll be minor disagreements on this, but I don't see that it's something the Conservatives may be willing to give ground on this to get a deal through with Labour, or at least make it like not as hard for Labour MPs to dislike this deal.
And I mean, we're already at 9 on a list compared to, say, Labour's 5, so there's probably more room for manoeuvre down here, although they'd still get criticism if they went against these things. But yeah, I think these next few, there's definitely probably wiggle room if they wanted it. So number 10, the freedom to strike new trade deals around the world, and we're already consulting on these.
Okay, big red line alert. This one should be flashing up and going, oh no, the whole thing's dead in the water. We've kind of touched on the customs union before. This is the bit where they really, really differ. Those free trade deals around the world just wouldn't be possible if we were part of that customs union. We can't go and negotiate our own deal with Japan because we've already got one, and the EU wouldn't allow us to if we were still in a customs union. Conservatives have always preferred free trade agreement, and you may argue about how successful they've been with those free trade agreements. We're already consulting on these is 2 years old, and last time I checked, Liam Fox hadn't been able to negotiate many replacement trade deals in the time that he had as International Trade Secretary.
I think, I mean, may not be a quotable number, might have to put something in the show notes, but I think there was a thing saying there's 9 that are actually like kind of lined up, and then there's a number of other ones that are still in progress. But again, they're not with particularly massive countries. They're not equivalent to what we have in the EU right now.
I always like the BBC's reality check. Whatever your opinion of the BBC and their kind of editorial choices, I always find that reality check at least does give you the facts on a lot of things, and it's my go-to as a non-biased just source of information if you just want to clear things up, because there's a lot of ways that you can spin about what deals we've got. So we've got a list of the 9 there. I don't know if you want to read those out, Wilco.
So yes, these are called continuity deals, which I assume means they're just basically keeping the same benefits we already have, the same arrangement essentially. And out of 40, we have 9. They are Norway and Iceland, the Caribbean countries, it's not specific, the Pacific Islands, Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Switzerland, the Faroe Islands, Eastern and Southern Africa, which again is not particularly specific. I don't know how that breaks up in reality, and Chile. So yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, some of those places are useful. I like having rum and Toblerones, but there are definitely some places there that are quite small, and I imagine it wasn't very hard to get them. For example, the Faroe Islands agreeing to be able to trade in the same way they have with the UK was probably quite an easy sell, because we probably have quite substantial relative buying power to them, whereas it's not the same when you're talking to like the whole EU or China.
Exactly. There are obvious names missing off that list. China and the US would probably be top of that. And even if you're looking at if you want to look at the G10, let me see if I can grab a list of the G10 countries, which are usually the biggest countries in the world in terms of their economic group. Belgium, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, and the United States. So we've been able to successfully agree a deal with 1 out of the G10, which is Switzerland, which probably has quite a unique agreement with the EU anyway. They're used to that. The fact that we could be cutting ourselves off from so many markets, and the fact that we haven't been able to agree deals with some of the more developing nations should be a big concern for the UK. So I think that line in the Conservative manifesto should definitely be taken with a pinch of salt, and 2 years on arguably could be seen as a failure for the Conservative government to secure those deals in time for the first proposed Brexit date.
Okay, number 11. Continued security cooperation to keep our people safe. I feel like it needs to be bum, 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 bum.
Vague here, again, like I mentioned, if you say the opposite of that, to keep our people unsafe, that's a ridiculous statement. But certainly one that I think both Labour and Conservatives can agree on. The only thing I might point out here is I've put a little link there, and I will try and copy it into chat, which is from Labour itself, which includes 6 reasons why they think the deal is bad. And one of their sticking points was they said that it was bad for security, that Theresa May's deal actually sort of made a lot of contracts with the EU run out by 2020, and that would put it in jeopardy. So Labour, if they're going to agree to May's deal in any case or copy-paste bits of that, they'll be looking to improve on security concerns, or at least make them a lot firmer so they don't end up with egg on their face. If you've just criticised somebody for doing a bad job and then you sign up to their deal anyway, that makes you look pretty silly.
Oh, our politicians do like looking pretty silly, so we'll see what happens with that. Finally, point 12, an independent foreign and defence policy.
This is very closely linked to point number 11, kind of a conservative rallying cry, I'd almost say, like an independent foreign and defence policy. We're Britain, we can, stand up against anything. We don't need anybody else. We don't need to, get ourselves involved in the EU. That's a good goal to have, and I think... that's a good goal to have from the Conservatives' point of view, if it's actually achievable in a world where the UK does most of its military operations in conjunction with NATO, and most of those have been in conjunction with France recently. I don't think that's one that's realistically going to happen.
I mean, we're still going to be part of Five Eyes, etc. There's all these things that we are a part of, and it's not just because we're in the EU.
So here you see another point. I don't see Labour disagreeing on this, but that last point seems like a bit of throwaway Conservative flag waving more than anything else than an actual serious point going into EU negotiations.
So we've compared the points. During the last 2 weeks, there's been lots of photos of Keir Starmer looking very serious outside of number 10. When I last checked, they kept describing talks as positive, things like this, but nothing's really happened yet. And we have 3 days until we fall out, although there has been an ask from Theresa May for a longer extension, and then there's been back and forth as to whether that extension could even be a year. But at the moment, are we any clearer on what's happening in 3 days' time?
In short, no.
I thought that might be. Could you expound on no?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So we've pointed out the customs union, huge sticking point. That's what's going to foul up any talks between May and Corbyn. One of them is going to have to budge. My inkling is that it will have to be May who budges. I think the EU would probably be quite keen on a customs union anyway. It solves a lot of problems. It does solve the backstop in a sense. But it's certainly a lot softer Brexit than Theresa May would have originally be comfortable with. But that might be something where she's willing to risk losing some of her party in order to gain the Labour Party votes. However, there's one sticking point which might not bring enough Labour politicians along with it. Out of all of those points that we've mentioned from the Conservative manifesto and the Labour one, what's the one issue that hasn't been brought up at all? Nobody's mentioned it in the positive or the negative. They've just brushed over it.
Well, I think there's probably two. There's no mention of Article 50 itself, unless you count the "we will leave by the 29th of March," which has already failed. And there's also no mention of another referendum, one way or the other, whatever that second referendum would be.
That second referendum is a point that a lot of Labour MPs would that's the hill they would die on. There's a tactic used by critics of Jeremy Corbyn during PMQs that they can sort of ask a question to Theresa May, but subtly imply something, or not so subtly in this case, to Jeremy. So there was one by Owen Smith, who had previously run against Jeremy Corbyn in a leadership election. And has been quite a vocal critic of Corbyn's policy towards the second referendum. He thinks that Corbyn has been lukewarm on the idea, and Owen Smith was sort of like proclaiming it from the benches, saying like, no, this is a policy we've got to pursue. In PMQs last week, he sort of said, when Theresa May sits down with Jeremy Corbyn and discusses the prospect of a customs union and a second referendum, will she agree on those points? So he's putting words in Corbyn's mouth there and just sort of reminding Corbyn that, by the way, this is what Labour MPs like me expect from your talks, and if you don't get them, we might not vote for them. So that's one of the big sticking points as well that neither side seems willing to face head on. I think May would lose votes from a customs union, but when the votes were held in Parliament about, the free votes in Parliament about what was most agreeable, what method they thought of going forward, the customs union only lost by 3 votes. Compare that to the second referendum idea that I think lost by a far heavier margin. I think May would lose far more Conservative voters if she pushed for a second referendum compared to if she pushed for a customs union, and that's what she conceded in these talks.
So we're not having meaningful vote for, but we need... We think we're not having it. We need to. We've discussed before. There's these various chunks, and we looked at the indicative votes. You've just mentioned them and brought them up. If we try and summarise very broadly the sections we have in Parliament right now, and I mean less broad than just Labour and Conservatives, because obviously there are subsets there. But what kind of deal does Theresa May need to bring in order to win enough votes? You've just mentioned customs union. So is it going to be a customs union-y deal? Is something going to come out of these Labour talks? Where do we think this is going to go? I don't know. This is very much kind of putting you on the spot for a wild stab in the dark, and it could be changed by tomorrow morning. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in each party at the moment that we kind of need to look at.
Yeah, so I think the option that splits the Conservative Party the least is going with a customs union, but with no second referendum. So this deal basically relies on Labour and Conservative support, but ignores the other parties. So I was just going to run down the other parties and how they'd vote quickly, and then I'll whip round to Labour and Conservative. So with no second referendum, you lose the support of the SNP, the Lib Dems, and Change. Those are parties that have, particularly the Lib Dems and Change, they are parties that are built on the idea of we want a people's vote. That's what we stand for. if Labour tried to convince them, or Conservatives say that, no, you've got to abandon those principles and support our deal, they might as well just not exist. It's asking them to commit political suicide by voting against that. So that's just not going to happen. So they wouldn't support the deal. But you're only losing, well, the Lib Dems and Change, you're losing like 20 to 30 votes, I think, in total. So not the end of the world, but every vote counts, as we've seen in Brexit matters. You really do need to have the support of everyone. Then we've got the SNP, who my suspicion is they might not be able to support this deal either, unless it was really sort of national interesty. The thing we haven't mentioned alongside the referendum is there's nothing in there about devolution. The SNP were very critical of Theresa May's 395-page deal when it came out, that it had no mention of Scotland in there, and they felt quite offended by that. Labour doesn't seem to have mentioned it in these talks as well. There's nothing in that 5-point letter. There's nothing on their website. You think there might be more, because Labour would need to win back Scottish voters in order to, have a hope in a general election, in my opinion. But that's another talk for another day. So I think the SNP might also need some concessions if they were to come along for this deal as well. So if things were close, it might be the case that Labour and Conservatives come with a deal and then maybe get the SNP in later to confirm it. But as it stands, I don't think if the SNP evolved that they will vote for the deal. So that again loses you a sizable chunk of votes. That's, oh gosh, how many SNP members are there? 40 odd?
It's most of Scotland, basically.
Yeah. So you're already 70 votes down. Then let's move to the DUP, who have supported the Conservatives in everything but Brexit. They're not going to support this. If this deal still has the backstop, which it all in likelihood will, they'll just ignore it. Then we'll move on to the Conservatives. So Theresa May's got a real problem here with the Conservative Party and how they might vote. We already know the ERG probably won't support anything with a customs union. That's 30 to 40 odd seats gone there. The bigger problem might be keeping her cabinet together. Her cabinet is made up of half Remainers, half Brexiteers, and the Sunday papers were full of rumours that she would lose the support of her cabinet. The cabinet was in open revolt against her over this idea to go and have talks with Labour. Now, these talks are ongoing. The cabinet is still together, so maybe they've accepted that this is the only way forward, or maybe they're biting their tongue until a deal finally comes out, and once they know the terms of that deal, they may resign in their droves. So it does cause quite a serious split within the Conservatives. The next question then becomes, how much of a personal mandate does Theresa May have within the Conservative Party? What's the pull of her for people to stay loyal to her and get this deal through? Unfortunately, the answer is she doesn't have much. She's burnt up a lot of her political capital trying to get this deal through. She's had to renege on promises in trying to woo the ERG. She's lost the faith of quite a few softer Brexiteers, so not even they're automatically guaranteed to jump to her side. Also, a lot of political sort of like whipping. Why you vote with the candidate, why you are a loyal MP, is because, if I'm loyal to my party and my government, there's a chance I could be a minister one day.
You don't want to be one of those in this government right now.
Well, exactly. What's the incentive to become a minister in a Theresa May government for a leader that is, she's a dead woman walking in political terms. She's already said that she won't contest the next election and that she'll stand down as soon as her deal's gone through. So there's no long-term gain to be held by that. All her political capital within the Conservative Party is burnt up, essentially. So you may be able to rely on, I think there were a couple of sort of like barometers for success of how many people would just go with Theresa May, and there were a few indicative votes that were sort of like, here's the government option amongst these parliamentary indicative votes, and they garnered about 170, 190 votes, so leaking that many Conservatives, like 100 to 120, I think, from what they've got. I'm doing parliamentary math in my head, so apologies if it's a little off. But she's still leaking a lot of support, and that would need quite a sizable amount of Labour supporters, Labour MPs, to jump over and save Theresa May.
Yeah. So, I mean, considering that's relatively unlikely, so we've got. Let's try and summarise everything since last time. So, meaningful vote for seems unlikely. Labour and the Conservatives getting something that will pass Parliament out of their discussions seems unlikely. So if that all fails, what are our options left? I think we've only got 3, right? We can have an extension. We can revoke Article 50, or fall out with no deal. Which Parliament has voted against happening, but I must remind people will still legally happen if we do nothing. So what do we think is the most likely option there?
So the least likely is no deal, for a few reasons. That's the only thing Parliament's been clear on that it doesn't want to happen. That's the one that's been passed into law, been signed off. The Cooper Amendment. She's posted on Twitter yesterday that it's been passed. As you've said, that it's a good sort of case study in why EU law is still sort of trumps UK law, because even though the no deal thing is sovereign and would be respected in ours, that's the official position of our government, of our country, to avoid a no deal now, we are still entirely reliant on the will of the EU to give us an extension to avoid that no deal. What the EU says at this moment in time goes. Theresa May is seeking an extension for the 30th of June, which the EU doesn't like for a number of reasons, most importantly the fact that that's about a month and a bit after EU elections. The UK would probably have to take part in that and then might have to put their MPs out after a month. That's a huge faff. It messes up EU rules. If we're going to be part of the EU, we might as well be part of it. So I think the EU would want quite a longer extension than that. So I think that that extension is still possible. The other option is that we actually get a deal passed, which again I think is unlikely. We've talked about the political math, and we've talked about even this compromise deal possibly failing, with not enough Conservatives to go along, and maybe some weaknesses, some revolts in the Labour Party amongst those who want a people's vote, or those people who just don't like Jeremy Corbyn very much. You've got to remember that Corbyn's not exactly a popular leader within his own party, particularly amongst his MPs. So many of those might revolt. So that's also another problem to get a deal through. The indicative votes within Parliament, again, have failed to produce a majority. So
there's no clear way forwards.
So there's no, so exactly. So then you get to the point of revoking Article 50. And I'm honest when I say this, I didn't think I'd even consider this as an option at the start of the year, that this would happen. But things have got Parliament's become so stuck that we're now in a position where we face having to go back to the EU every other month, every 2 months, to say, sorry, we still can't sort this out. Can we have another extension, please? Can we have another extension, please? And that's quite wearing. And the way to sort this out is to revoke Article 50, stop the ticking clock, hold a general election or something that might change the parliamentary math, and then go back with a parliament that has a mandate for a deal. I don't think revoking Article 50 would mean the end of Brexit entirely.
No, but it's like we need to put... I think I agree that we need to put some kind of halt on this, because otherwise we're never going to make enough difference between each, we need a small extension, and especially with stuff like the European elections and what might happen there, if we have to go into a longer and longer extension, it gets very awkward, as I think we've touched on before. So, it seems like the only reasonable option is just stopping Article 50 and being like, look, we are going to leave, but we need to work things out.
Precisely. It was... I feel like I'm repeating myself again. We always said at the start when we started this podcast, we thought it wasn't long enough, didn't we? We always said we said that even before the idea of this podcast crossed our minds in the Hat of Many Things episode where you came on. Yeah, it's been something we can see coming for a while, and we simply need more time to get this sorted. And the way that we can do this in the most orderly fashion, and maybe bring some certainty back to business. We're in a really horrible period now, particularly now the first date has passed, and we're now with oh, is Brexit going to happen in 3 days' time, or is it going to happen in a month, or is it not going to happen at all? It's a nightmare for businesses to prepare. I know, personally from where I work within the NHS, it's having effects on what's going on here. It's not affecting maybe patient care, but it affects how, what's happening with the stockpiling of drugs, etc. What's happening, with, can we go forward and make decisions? No, we better wait until we know what's happening with Brexit before we commit to very big changes. It's that kind of thing that must be happening across businesses across the country, and will only lead to sort of like a stagnating economy, or will have, not very good effects.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen there are companies they're holding off on investments and decisions and so on. I mean, you have to have a fair amount of money and be doing very well as a company to still be hiring and planning big infrastructure projects and stuff like that, if you're not sure where things are going to fall next week.
Precisely. So I think if the EU offered us an extension of sort of like 2 years, we might as well just revoke Article 50 and start again and get a new government in to negotiate Brexit. One where the parliamentary math is more favourable, one where we have an election campaign that's more based on Brexit. It's the one thing that's always sort of been very curious about me about the 2017 campaign. It was, many people thought that was a foregone conclusion, that the Conservatives would just win.
I mean, clearly they did, because they held an early general election.
Yeah, but the conversation wasn't really about Brexit. It became on, Labour's proposals and Labour's sort of like new way of thinking, and that was an awakening of the left and a new way of the left being able to campaign in British politics, and got a lot of enthusiasm up. But Labour's Brexit policy, as we've talked about before, was sort of like non-existent or pushed to one side in that election, and everybody thought the Conservatives win would so much that the Conservatives didn't really bother to talk about Brexit. Theresa May's manifesto was one that was, I wanted to say conservative, but that's obvious, was quite realistic and pragmatic. She didn't offer anything too flashy. She offered what she thought the Conservatives could deliver, and as a result sort of undersold what the Conservatives could do, and maybe that attributed to her losing. But we thought 2017 would be the Brexit election. It wasn't. What I think I know for certain is that the next general election will almost certainly be fought on the terms of Brexit, particularly if we haven't left the EU by the time that we have the next general election. So that's a lot longer than my original answer on those 3 points. But I think what's most likely is revoke Article 50, providing that A, there's still a plan for the UK to leave the EU, and B, that a general election happens to adjust the parliamentary math and find a parliament that can get something through. And they probably need to do that on the back of a Brexit-based election with a clear manifesto where they can point to something and say, this is what you voted for, you all knew what you were voting for this time, this is the plan that we will take to the EU.
I think we should do a very quick polls update. Have you had a look at the polls?
Yes, I have. Let me just bring it up.
So I think I will continue with our description from last time. So we mentioned there was kind of a steady downward trend for Labour and the Conservatives, and then around end of January, Labour started to take this nosedive and the Conservatives were going up, and we were all like, that's a bit weird because the Conservatives are handling this Brexit thing very badly. Not that Labour were doing any better, but it was weird that Labour took such a hit. And it seems like it's finally catching up with the Conservatives. Around the 11th of March, everything started to turn against them, and now they're dropping down. Labour has plateaued at around 34%, and the Conservatives have come diving down from 40% to 36%. And, of their current trajectory, they're going to hit Labour fairly quickly. And if you look in the other three parties, Lib Dem's fairly flat. UKIP, the Greens had a bit of a jump, but UKIP are starting to rise up again, and I think to me it's fairly clear that will be all this stuff about us not actually leaving. So those Conservative voters who had come back from UKIP are now realigning to UKIP because they're worried they're not going to get the Brexit they were promised. And especially if the big date that everyone thought was coming has passed and nothing happened, well, I don't think it's surprising that they would feel that way. If we actually look at I can't remember what the last poll was we looked at, but we had all these really large Conservative polls, like +11, +10. And if you look in the last four polls, so from the 22nd of March, we have Conservatives +1, tie, Labour +5, Conservatives +1. So that's definitely much closer. Very much narrowed the gap.
Yeah, your analysis is spot on, particularly with the UKIP one. If you liked Jacob Rees-Mogg and that was the reason you were voting Conservative, and now he decided to back May's deal, and now you don't think Brexit is going to happen, you're likely to jump back to UKIP, who have always promised that, no deal is the way, and we leave, and this is a betrayal of the elites, against the working man of Britain. All of that kind of like populist UKIP rhetoric will resonate with more people. The more Parliament messes around, and the more they struggle to get a deal through. Labour certainly have plateaued. I think they may have found their ceiling at the moment, or at least, they've gone down to a level which was, sorry, when I say, I didn't mean ceiling. Sorry, Labour may have found their floor with how low the vote can go for them. Now I can see that it's flattening out. If you consider the sort of like the long tail and how unpopular Jeremy Corbyn was when the Labour Party was, polling at about 26% at one point in 2017, for him now to be at, him and the Labour Party to be at 34% as their low point, they might consider that quite a big jump, and show that they can keep people interested even if they are seen to like have a slightly different view on Brexit or be a bit more Brexity than they were before. The only thing I wanted to add, and I love this website that gives us the polls, the one thing that stands out to me is that Delta poll +5 seems to be way out. And when I look at the last Delta poll that happened on the 23rd of February, that gave the Conservatives a 7-point lead. So that's certainly the biggest swing I've seen within a poll group. Nate Silver's 538, when they do the polls in the US election, they usually have like a rating for each pollster, sort of giving them like from A to C. Because there are some pollsters like Ramerson, I think, they've always been like weighted Conservative voters, so they give that a C vote. Meanwhile, other ones are more accurate about how they reflect things. So I wouldn't take you can never take the polls as 100% certain, particularly ones that jump around so much. But I think that poll certainly shows a trend that the Conservatives are losing support the longer Brexit doesn't go on. And as you said, if they are falling and continue to fall and Labour have plateaued, maybe the next few months we can see Labour becoming more popular than Conservatives. That very fact might make a general election less likely, because the Conservatives would need to prompt that general election in the first place, but may be so desperate by then, or the Conservative Party may be so split by then that a general election may be the only hope that the country has of getting out of the sort of stalemate that it's found itself in.
Yeah, I mean, none of these options fill me with confidence at the moment, but we'll keep our eye on the news and let's see how this all shakes out. Following Brexit is interesting at the very least. I know we say some weeks we're talking about the same things back and forth, but somehow there's always some new twist. People learn something new about parliamentary procedure, something like that. So there is a lot going on. This week has actually been relatively quiet, I think, because it's all been behind closed doors. But yeah, it's a wild roller coaster, and we'll be following along every step of the way. Well, we're coming up to the end of the episode. I just want to say, I think the new microphone is doing well, isn't it? I can notice the quality difference, so I hope the listeners at home, once I've done the edit, will be able to notice the quality difference. It's partly funded by we have one very generous Patreon donor, so if you want to go and help fund such improvements to the podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/TTSS. You can also find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on our website at parliamentary.observer. And of course, you can find us on Twitter and on Instagram at unparlpodcast. Other than throwing some money our way and coming and discussing the episodes, which is obviously great. Whatever app you're using to listen to this podcast, the two best things you can do are subscribe so that adds to our RSS feed and helps Google realize we exist. But also, you can leave a review. It doesn't have to be on Apple Podcasts, though obviously that's great. That's where most people seem to go. But there are lots of websites out there with reviews. You can favorite us. Whatever it is you can do to spread knowledge of this podcast, that'd be great. I mean, we've spent some money on some new equipment. We're not going anywhere, but it's always nice to hear that people like the podcast and what they might want us to change. We've had a few episodes of that headlines. Is that something you want us to stick with? Do the headlines date it too much? I don't know. I quite like the idea of it being this kind of time capsule of what was going on at the time. But if the headlines are getting in the way of the big Brexit discussion, we have been pushing them aside. So let us know. That'd be a bit of feedback we'd like to hear. And final thing, of course, you can come and find us on Discord and join in and be in the chat. You hear us mentioning the chat quite a lot in an episode. It's great to have feedback live while we're recording. So yeah, come on down and have a chat with us. It's always good. And one other thing, I think this is probably the last... Oh no, there might be another episode before I run the London Marathon, so there'll be a link in the show notes to sponsor me if people feel so inclined. I need to raise £2,000 in order to run for Teenage Cancer Trust. They help people, families and teenagers with cancer. Obviously, cancer sucks, so anything we can do to help people deal with that terrible disease is great. So any money that can go that way, if you have the funds, please do that. I'd rather you sponsored that than gave us money on the Patreon. So yeah, please come along and follow that link as well. That'll be in the show notes. And yeah, Rob, thanks for joining me as always. I think it's goodbye from me.
And it's a goodbye from him.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Bye. That made me sound like I was really old there when I said app.